the most loved of all the artists in historically. Now, so let's look at what is happening here. And you're going to just nod one more time and tell me that you can indeed see artistic rivals. Yes? So now I'm going to take away my picture altogether, and we're going to see. These two works of art became a phenomenal contribution to the 20th century. One of them was made by Matisse, and just 2 years later, this one by Picasso. Both of them shook the world. But we have to know a lot more about what is going on as the underpinning for all this. And one of the ways that we can approach this subject is we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the role of an artist in society? And we'll see toward the end of this lecture that we will have a definitive answer. What is it that Matisse and Picasso contributed to the world that made such a profound impact on it? Because the fact that history paintings, and that is to say, paintings that were made that had to do with historical context in terms of older New Testament stories, or they had to do with Greek or Roman myths, or they had to do with famous battles. And so these were known as history paintings. They documented important events that were historical and religious and mythological. Of course, great emperors fell in under the heading of portrait paintings, so that those people that had a huge impact in the world, they are the ones that had the right to be on a canvas, and everyone else was secondary. Therefore, as I said, the French Impressionists, they're going to make paintings of everyday life, of landscapes, of cityscapes, of the countryside, and make paintings of animals and still life. Their work always has been considered in the Catholic countries to be inappropriate categories of art. They had no standing whatsoever. So only history and portrait paintings of important people were considered to be appropriate. This too has a large discussion behind it, and we can talk about that further. But right now we're going to focus on the fact that we see that these obviously are significant history paintings. They are making a picture here. Jacques-Louis David, Ingres is making a painting of the most powerful man in Europe for about a decade and a half. Napoleon's painting is made here in 1806, and we can see what happens in this 100-year period. Wow, what a difference. This is because of the democratization of the European continent. This is the reason that we have this big difference. In a democracy, the individual is important. In an oligarchy, in an authoritarian regime, only the man at the top is important. What we can see today is that we can go to a museum, and in one part of the museum, as generally it's laid out chronologically, we will see a painting that is a classical painting, a history painting of this important man. But down the road, this is also hanging in the museum. So what we are saying is that this is a painting of the most powerful man in Europe, and this is a painting that exists in only one man's imagination. Therefore, you are saying just one simple man, if he is able to make a painting this radical, and it is a kind of a representation of a democratic ideal, that the individual is important, you can see that a lot of things had to happen between 1806 to 1906. Now, as we said momentarily, just a few moments ago, is that there were many revolutions that took place in the European world. One of the significant ones in Paris was in the 1830s, but there were many, many uprisings and revolutions all over the European continent because people were becoming enamored with the idea that the democracy in the United States was taking shape. And since it was about 70 years later, they wanted the same for them in Europe. This year, which experienced tremendous upheaval and all kinds of armies being squelched and all kinds of things taking place where people wanted to be free and ruled by men that spoke their own language. Say in the case of Hungary, they didn't want the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was German, to lead them forever. They wanted people that were concerned about them, that were local people that spoke their own language, and consequently upheavals. Now, the humanities steps in quite often to try to quell people's anxieties. And never mind that we're having revolutions all over the European continent, we also have, within a decade or so, the upheaval of the introduction of the origin of species, which, as you can see here, Darwin is being satirized as half monkey, half man. This is a difficult thing to make kind of an appeal to people who have believed for millennia that God created the universe in 6 days. On the 7th day, man rested, etc. And now we are being told that our first cousins are chimpanzees. Well, one of the ways that the French Impressionists approached this dilemma was to say to people that, yes, animals and mankind are different, though we have many qualities that are the same as well. But animals experience the world in a different way. Humans experience the world with our sensations, and consequently, what happens with French Impressionist art is their work tends to sparkle and shimmer in the way that we would see the world. And animals are far less in terms of their ability and their capacity to experience the world. They simply exist in a world which to us is a wonderland. And then this continued interest in how mankind is different, we begin to see one of the first novels that's written in what has not is a stream of consciousness style, an idea that actually is going to be postulated maybe 30 years later. But what happens with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is he shows us the complex inner workings of a mind, and a particular mind, the mind of someone that has committed a crime, that has obsessive compulsive thoughts, and how rich and complex the human brain is and how it works. All of these ideas are going to eventually lead to a very important investigation of the human brain. So one of the things that led Freud to his psychoanalytic theories was that he was interested in creating the ideas around what dreams mean. Of course, this is one of his first contributions, is the kind of the interpretation of dreams. So again, he's venturing into the ether. He's venturing into ideas that exist somewhere beyond the human mind even. And this idea of studying the human mind then requires a vocabulary so that you can be clear about the differentiation between animals and men. So of course, we all know that we have id instincts, which are animalistic, because he created this kind of vocabulary in which we can say that the ego is what we present socially to the public. And then the superego is kind of the spiritual part of humankind and our morals and the way that we behave in the world on a level that is greater than just simply interaction. Another thing that he made us very well aware of was how much of the human mind and how much of our motivations and our ideas are hidden from the world. What we are consciously aware of is maybe 10% of what is going in the interior scope of our life. Because things began to be more and more spiritual in nature, and this is the time, by the way, in history when the Theosophical Society is going to become a very important way for people to cope with life. If you're going to go against church dogma, then you have to then give people another option of which to connect with God. And again, we can go back to Spinoza. Spinoza was the philosopher that was proposing that nature is God and that you can find God everywhere. You are part of this collective consciousness. That's what he was saying to people so many hundreds of years ago. I've become a complete devotee of Spinoza. But he would have been known far and wide everywhere because he was the person that was funneling this kind of information that became known as the Enlightenment, which later led to democracies all over many countries. But what happens at this point is there's so much talk about ethereal things that artists cannot make proper renderings of a world that is not realistic anymore. Or what I should say is they cannot necessarily represent realistic things that they see in the world because there's so much being spoken about that is something you cannot put your finger on, but something to be discussed philosophically and kind of in a very high tone because you're elevating yourself as a mystic. You want to be a mystic. You want to be part of something much greater that connects the whole world. That's what spirituality does. It doesn't teach one specific way to look at life. It gives you respect for all religions because no singular religion can cover everything that will give you what you need as a human as you're reaching your apotheosis as a human being. So whereas, say, the Renaissance was a time when church and state were one, and life was not so complex, what was invented at this time was single point perspective, because there is, after all, only one way to look at life. You have a vanishing point here. Everything begins with philosophy. So we have Plato and Aristotle, all of the geniuses of the ancient Roman and Greek world that contributed to the science, to the arts, etc., are represented here. But as the world becomes more and more complex, well, single point perspective is just not going to do it. Because now we begin to see the work of Cezanne, who is a thinking man. He was an intellectual. He started to make these still lifes, which we already know don't have much room in terms of prestige in the art world. But he starts to make this kind of art that has multiple points of perspective. This is not how we would see the table laid in front of us if we're making a still life, because we see that there are points going in this way, and then there are points going in that way, and then things are kind of, and certainly this would not look this way in real life. So what's happening with him is he's starting to create more complex representations of things that we recognize, but they are singularly not realistic, not completely realistic. So we see that there's a huge infusion in the art world of the personality of the artist that is doing his experiments. He didn't do this in a vacuum. As I said, everything is connected. He was very much influenced by Japanism. The Japanese world was not so interested in categories of art necessarily. They had their renderings of emperors and dynasties and all that. But in the Japanese world, if you wanted to make art, you could just make a piece of art, because you were enchanted by a sprig of flowers, because you were kind of interested in how the butterflies are getting nectar. If you just want to study a beautiful little bird and show your respect for nature. What happens in the Japanese world is, because they were far away from Western ideals in terms of perspective and making a realistic representation, their work was much more like lithographic representations, which are typically two-dimensional. But if you're going to do something that's two-dimensional and does not look realistic, you have to be able to add a story that's dramatic or at the very least interesting in some way. So when Hakusai made these 24 renderings of a typhoon in Kanagawa, he's showing us the dramatic effect and the danger that these people are in when the ocean waves are doing these kind of dramatic somersaults. Because the West was introduced to Oriental work and it was two-dimensional, this is one of the reasons that we see the work of Vincent van Gogh being this kind of two-dimensional, but at the same time, his strokes are far more pronounced than the other French Impressionists for his reasons. But we can see that there is a direct correlation between the drama and the flattening of surfaces of the Orient, and also the way that Vincent van Gogh uses color blocks. This again was another contribution from the Orient. They made these kind of spiritual works, which again fit in beautifully with the idea of spirituality that was being propagated in lots of Western countries. And they made these kind of floating world images with color blocks and obviously very much a sensitivity that would be appealing to everyone, very calming. Now, the way that they added a lot of drama to personal drawings, say, of people, was the body posture, how it was placed, told a story, the facial expression, the color blocks, and sort of the dynamism that we see that is taking place here. We're getting the idea, though this samurai soldiers the warrior's swords are going to be flying, we already get this impression that he's going to pull back the bow. So we see that there are dramatic effects that are being created here because they can't make it look realistic, but it's their own style of dramatization. And this is how it sort of came to pass in the West. This is how it was translated by Toulouse-Lautrec. This is how all of those ideas of color blocks and dynamic colors and this flattening of perspectives, but this is also kind of a spiritual story of Gauguin's life in Tahiti, or say Vincent van Gogh's pictures of boats and so on. A significant event that took place in the 1800s was this idea of understanding the science of color, how the eye works when it looks at certain colors. And in fact, there was so much that was going on at this period. This is one of the reasons that we saw the work of Seurat, which we will come back to in just a moment. What Seurat did with his pointillist experiments was there was also a lot of investigation into how the human eye, when it sees two colors together, if your eyes are working properly, what will happen is that your eyes will blend them because of the mechanism of the eye, and it will make a third color. So this is why all of these various experiments were taking place. Everyone was absolutely obsessed with all of the ideas that had to do with color theory and the value of colors. Now, when I do the lecture next month on abstract art, understanding abstract art, I'm going to go into a lot of detail as to which colors complement each other and which colors make the work pop. And this is one of the things that we see here that is happening with concentric circles by Kandinsky. He is studying how colors work on your eye and then work on your emotions. But again, this very important interest in color theory is going to determine a lot of the work of Henri Matisse. If you don't mind, I'm just going to stop for a moment and I'm going to mute everyone so that there's not any interference. All right, so then we can continue with sharing the screen and see again, this is Matisse's home. His parents were very much involved living in this northern part of France, they were very much involved in the prominent industries of that locale in France. That part of France was known for putting out incredibly beautiful tapestries and all kinds of fabrics and laces. That part of the world, that was their talent. That was their great contribution to the world. His family, as I said, was very much involved at certain times in selling different colors of wools, different colors of threads that were required for that, and paints as well. In later years, what will happen with Matisse, who is going to be studying for the law as a young man, but who will, I think will have contracted TB or something and was in bed for a long time. His mother brought paints to him to entertain him, and this will become his life's work. But the fact that his family was already so much immersed in an industry that made decorative and beautiful things, he was attracted to the works of Gustave Moreau. Gustave Moreau was a French symbolist painter. He's making a painting here of the Oedipus Rex and the Sphinx, that he has to, come up with an answer for the Sphinx. He was making these kind of symbolist works, but also became much more known for these elaborate decorative interiors and beautiful women, beautiful shapes of women, and kind of mystical spiritual settings. And this is one of the works, if you would be lucky enough to go to the Moreau Museum in Paris, to see kind of these interiors that were so stylized and exotic, and were using color theory to the limit, because all of these contrasting colors that are used here make everything come alive in this incredible way that is defined as Moreau's style. What Matisse is going to do at a certain juncture, he will take go to Morocco, Tangiers, and he will be, again, completely enamored with the decorative style of the Orient. This is why in future works, we will just see a hodgepodge of all kinds of elements. And we will always, always, always see kind of this civilized, beautiful, sensitive style of Matisse, which will always be contrasted with the brutishness of Picasso. But well and truly, no one could beat Picasso because of his creative spirit and the experiments and the kind of the way that he was eager to put himself out in the world, which was breaking so many rules. Most everything that we see of Matisse's, say, even though he's doing his color theory experiments, knowing how these colors complement each other and how everything will pop, and how he's using these color contrasts, and he's flattening the surface, and he's using color blocks, and we recognize everything here, and it looks realistic, although it's dramatically different than anything we've ever seen before. This was made around 1905 and 6. Now, Matisse, he's a person that likes to paint interiors. And because he liked to paint interiors, he was very much attracted to the works of Chardin. Chardin was a French artist that made paintings for the royal family. But when he wanted to please himself, he would make these kind of interior scenes. And he was pleased with himself just to do it for his pleasure or for a friend's home. This is not something that would be shown at a great art show because these are simple people. It has nothing to do with history paintings. But because Matisse was such a fan of these interiors, and because Matisse has so much going on in all his works, he very often makes it such a big jumble that at some point, Gertrude Stein said to him, "Where are the eyes going to rest? My goodness, there's so much color and so much going on here." So he started to use black and white areas. He very often started to include just black and white in his paintings, and almost every painting of his from here forward, you will see his use of black and white so that the eyes can just have a respite. She very much influenced the artists of her day and the authors. And again, we'll talk further about that. Essentially, kind of these interiors that were such an interest to Matisse, and this happens to be made by Jan Steen, who was a Dutch painter. In the Protestant world, they did make genre paintings, paintings of everyday life. This is, in fact, Jan Steen making a painting of exactly how a housewife should not run her home. They shouldn't drink so much that they fall asleep at the table. They should do their laundry periodically. They should not let the dog run wild and eat the best steak, etc. But these umber tones and kind of these shimmery tones of gold is what Matisse loved about Jan Steen. That's why his initial work starts to look kind of the same, the still lifes that he's making, the table settings, but he's including all of these ideas, and he's also showing, if he has a patron somewhere, or he's showing the world that he can do any kind of texture. That is the whole purpose of a still life. A still life is your ambassador for work, because you can show a patron that might want to have his elegant wife's painting made, her portrait made as a gift for her, or, you know, to be the centerpiece of their living room. You have to show him you can paint silver, you can paint porcelain, glass, you can make her beautiful jewels shine and come to life. You can do everything. You can paint even the human body proportionally. You can do anything. But what happens with Matisse, because he was a man that was supposed to be a lawyer and ended up an attorney, he didn't have a lot of money because he couldn't sell his art. Nobody necessarily wanted to buy his work. He couldn't even afford to pay a model to stand there and work for him. To be his model, you had to pay women by the hour to be your model. His wife was kind enough, or the woman that was helping them in the family periodically, she would stand there for him and model for him. But because everyone was sort of sick and tired of the fact that no money was coming into the house, he started painting still lifes in which there was not a person there, but it showed how amazing his work was and how technically brilliant he was, and especially for a young man who did not have a real art training. Well, what happens here is he has the good luck to meet Camille Pissarro. Camille Pissarro was a man who lived a long time. Consequently, he was a French Impressionist and a Post-Impressionist. There's a slight difference. But Camille Pissarro was a man that was the grandfather to all young artists. And he was anyone who wanted to know how to do something, where to buy paints, where to do with this and that and the other, because now Matisse is living in Paris. He becomes the charge of Camille Pissarro for a while. And Pissarro says to him, although, and this is the work of Pissarro, kind of, you can see this shimmeriness that goes on here. When he says to Matisse, your work is technically lovely and amazing, but these are the people that are doing lots and lots of experiments with color. Lots of innovative ideas are being proposed at this time. You can't keep making still lifes like Chardin or Jan Steen. That's from the Baroque era. That's from the Renaissance era. You have to move along with the times. So Pissarro showed Matisse his own work. This is Pissarro's pointillist work. And he also introduced Matisse to the emotion-filled paintings of William Turner. William Turner had such a profound effect on the French Impressionists that when Monet makes this painting of Impression Sunrise, this is where they're going to get their name. Well, this was made around the 1860s, 1870s, and now we're talking about a period that's closer to the 1890s. So, whereas something like this is painted in a very, very different way than we're used to art being made, now we're starting to see distortions in art. What Pizarro encourages Matisse to do is to try to connect with his emotions as he's looking at the still life that he's painting. And so this way he can infuse his work. Pizarro is saying to him, you can infuse your work with new ways of making art, and you can think about how you can add elements of emotion, passion to your work, and things that go beyond what is something you would see in a physical space. Picasso at this time is living in Malaga. He's living in this part of the world, in Marbella, actually, which is even smaller than Malaga. He is living in this like nowheresville little town in Spain. And his mother says that he was such a shock. This little boy was such a shock when he was born because he had black eyes, completely black eyes, black hair, and he was tiny, always tiny for his age. And as a grown man, he was only 5'2". And he was built like a bull, very, very strong, but commanded the attention of everyone in the room, no matter where he was, so that by the time he was just 4 years old, his mother said that if he would go into the army, he would become a general. If he would join the church, for sure he would be the Pope. But since he decided that he would be an artist, he had to become Picasso. Now, as it happens, the mother's name is Picasso. The father's name is Ruiz, which is equivalent to saying that his name is Pablo Smith, Paul Smith. No way was he going to be a Smith, but he was going to be a Picasso. And his mother knew, and the father as well, because the father was an art teacher himself, that this boy had immense talent. They eventually are going to move to Barcelona, where the father is going to be an art instructor there, and where Picasso is going to learn more about artistic techniques, because by the time he was 12, he had already surpassed his father's skill. This is the work that got him tremendous attention. He made this work at the age of 15 and a half, 16. And what he is showing us that he is proficient at every texture. He's proficient in any kind of fabric, anything that glows, that metal. He can do anything, the most intricate lace work. This is how good he is. And in addition to this, not only does Lola, his sister, she is here getting communion, I'm assuming, or her first communion, I don't know exactly, but obviously kind of Catholic ritual. And the father is here. His father and his aunt are his models. And what does he tell us about his family? Well, there are 4 candles here, only 2 burning, because only he and his sister Lola survived their birth, and the other 2 children that his mother gave birth to died in infancy. You see, an artist, when he makes a realistic representation, he wants you to come into the painting. He wants you to become part of the story. He wants you to become one with the story. And artists have techniques of doing just that. One of the things that we see that is going on here is the way that he uses perspective, and he leaves a place for you to place your feet here. He leaves a place for you to come up to this podium and be part of this story visually. Every critic and professor of the school that he went to had nothing but extraordinary things to say about this young man, because his work was so exceptional at such a young age. But if you think that that was his best work, this is probably one of his best works. This is a story of his sister Lola again, who is his model, and his father is the doctor. So what is the dreaded story told here? When we look at a painting, and a painting like this is essentially a novel, it's an illustration of a big story. Abstract art is more like a poem. A painting like this is more like a novel. What are we being told here? When we see a picture of many generations together, it's a comfort to us to look at it because it represents our own life. This is what our life looks like. There are many generations in it. We see this young woman that is so close to death that her hand is already discolored. And the doctor is taking her pulse, and the news is ominous. This dark shadow tells us all we need to know. She is being painted here at a time when, say, a quarter to maybe a third of the European population was dying of tuberculosis. And what does he do to invite you into this work? Well, he leaves a place for you to place your foot there, visually place your foot there, to come and visit this girl. And on purpose, the bed is not straight. The bedding is not straight, because the only thing that you can do for this poor girl is straighten the bedclothes. But what sent shivers down his father's spine, and what told his father that he was a consummate artist? The watermarks under the window shutters. So this poor girl lives in a concrete space, in a stucco space that's wet. And that is certainly not conducive to getting well from tuberculosis. What won him world recognition was this work, because this was something that was on exhibition at the World's Fair that the Stein sisters and the Stein sister and brothers and sister-in-law attended. They were there, and this exhibition that took place during this year of 1900 was on both sides of the Seine. They essentially had something like an Epcot Center. Individual countries put a mock-up building up that was representational of the style of architecture from their country. Spain had one, America had one. Countries from all over the world had things on exhibition everywhere. And those that wanted to spend extra money put up kind of this mock-up building, as I said. In the Spanish pavilion, Picasso has this work as a representation of young artists from Spain. So what is he doing here that is so significantly than here? This is a realistic painting. We have focal point perspective. It ends here. This is how it works, right? We're looking at it from this point, and this is how this room looks. But now what we're doing is, what we're seeing is he is adopting this post-impressionist, Art Nouveau, flattened Japanese orientalized style and making it Western. There's no real focal point perspective. It's all very much flattened. He's using lots of color blocks He's got this chair for you here to invite you in. This is where you're going to sit if you want to join this party, or you can even have a dance on the dance floor. Everything is significantly flattened, and there is an atmosphere that is being created here, which on the one hand shows us the lustrous fabrics and how charming people are. But at the same time, we have a mood here, an emotional response from Picasso, in which he shows us that these women are like witches. And why are these women like witches? They're at the Moulin de la Galette, and they are essentially taxi dancers who hope that these very well-dressed men will go back home with them later that evening so that they will have their money to pay for the rent. And he certainly frequented places like that often. But he didn't think well of women, and we'll see that he will continue not to really think well of women, but he did have his positive attributes as well. What happens with this family is that Leo is going to be a Harvard man. Excuse me, this is Leo. Leo is going to be a Harvard man. Michael, Harvard. Gertrude Stein, Radcliffe, and 3 years at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. This woman is married to Michael. This is the ever-present au pair, and this young man who is the son of this couple. Leo and Gertrude are going to live together in an apartment, and this couple is going to live with the au pair in another. They decided, since they were highly educated and they adored everything having to do with the art world, that they would have to move to Paris. And after coming in 1900 to see that exposition, they were so taken by it. And also, they all lived off of family trust, which had to be divided among the 3 of them and 2 other siblings in America. They didn't have loads and loads and loads of money, but the American dollar was worth 10 French francs or so. So they could afford to rent in Paris and live in a good place near, say, the Luxembourg Gardens, but they couldn't afford to buy unlimited amounts of artwork. What they did when they came to live there in 1905 is they got their hands on what was left of some French Impressionist artwork. Also, Paul Gauguin's work had come from Tahiti all the way to France and was selling there. And then the very last Renoir that any of them could get their hands on was just sort of this little throwaway piece, which might be 8 by 6 inches. Renoir's son, who will become the famous film director, and the nanny that is taking care of him. They were able to buy the Cézanne, the 2 Gauguins, and a tiny Renoir, and boom, they were out of money. They had to wait until April 15th until they did their taxes again in America, and their trust can then be divided 5 ways. Well, as I said, the Stein family had met Picasso in 1900. And at that time, he was already living in Paris with a friend of his. He was living there. And because he was such a resounding success at the 1900s Expo, and because the Stein family was so taken with him, he makes this painting of himself at the age of 19 or so, and he labels it, Yo Picasso. I am Picasso. I am the man. And 18 months later, well, he's hungry and he's poor and he's living in a terrible, terrible, terrible place, about as far as you can go from Paris, in Montmartre, in a place that nobody wants to think of living at this time because you have to share your quarters with unpleasant critters. By the time that the Stein family comes back in 1905 and they meet up with him again, he is so delighted to sell them these 2 works, which nobody wants to buy. They're living in a prestigious place in, I think, the 6th arrondissement. They live in a beautiful, beautiful place, Gertrude and Leo. Later, Gertrude and Alice Toklas are going to live there. But just imagine the complete power of this brother and sister, and then Michael and Sarah Stein, that these pieces that they bought for maybe 50 or 100 American dollars from Picasso, who was kissing their hands while they did it, this work is at the MoMA. This work is about 6 feet tall, and it's one of the venues in which Modern Art Wing begins. This is at the MoMA. He was, Gertrude Stein, Leo Stein, this family was able to convince people that they should collect this work. What can you get from this work? This work, by the way, is at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. So imagine how effective their ideas were sold to the public. Again, Leo and Gertrude, they can't afford to buy the expensive stuff because at this point, the French Impressionists and the Modernists are already selling for a lot of money. And the Modernists at this point, there are people like Toulouse-Lautrec, Seurat, people like that. This is 1905, 1906. It's hard to get your hands on the work that's going all over the world elsewhere that has to do with the previous artist. So they buy works by Bonnard, who no one wants, and they buy more work from Picasso, again, because no one wants them. Well, so these works are in, I believe this work is, let me see if I can remember where that is. Oh, this is in a private collection, and this Bonnard piece is in Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne, that's how far their reach was. Here's a Photoshop picture of Sarah Stein, where she lives with her husband and son. And they are buying Matisse works and Picasso's works, and both of them are desperate to bring some money into the house. Again, these works end up in Sweden and in Paris. This one, I think, Luxury, is at the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris. And this one is in the Gothenburg Museum in Sweden. Well, Matisse is, when you ask both Matisse and Picasso, what are you doing here? Well, one of the things that they're saying is because they become friends and they become frenemies, I guess you can say, because they're friendly, but at the same time, they're so desperate to sell to people, and the Stein family are the only people that are purchasing their work. They sort of start to want to find their own voice. So Matisse is a fan of Seurat. He's a fan of color theory. So he starts making this kind of work, sort of on the back of Seurat's pointillism. And then he gets together with André Derain. And what are they doing? They're using these kind of color blocks. Again, these kind of innovative ways of making art. They're very much interested in studying the value of color as opposed to what you can see realistically. Now, by the way, color has value in terms of, and there have been studies done all over the world, by the way, where they've shown people in the Orient, in Arab countries, in the Western countries, in South America, everywhere imaginable, they show people colors that are blue, red, green, etc. And 88% of people in the world choose the same emotion that is connected to a color. So that, for example, you're blue when you're depressed. When the color is yellow, it's a sunny outlook on life. You're red with rage. You're purple with jealousy. Who knows? All these colors, pink and white, and all of these representational colors, they have value. So what André Derain is doing and what Matisse are doing is they're trying somehow to use the natural world by looking at it and responding to it emotionally with colors. As we said, if some people don't do these kind of experiments, you don't have other people that make other dramatic experiments. And abstract art is difficult to do. It's the most difficult art form to do because you have to give something that has no connection to real life visual objects that you would see, but you're essentially painting emotions with lines and color. But with Kandinsky, around this time that he's studying the work of Matisse, he's going a bit further, and he is saying for the first time in literary works that abstract art is like a poem, because to be an abstract artist, you must be a poet. Now, as long as Picasso is making works in which people can be at least recognized as human beings, let's say, certainly when we're looking at these works, we may not think they're great, and we may not know that they're studying volumes or whatever it is that they're doing. But what happens with Picasso is that everyone turns against him. Excuse me, I went to the wrong slide. Everyone turns against him when he decides that he doesn't want to make realistic representations anymore. In fact, Gertrude Stein is going to be the only one that will say that he has something to say about the world when his work starts to go out of the realistic realm. The precursor to Picasso's Cubism is Cezanne. And Cezanne was so highly revered by modern artists that they tip their hat to him because he's the first one that took this huge leap into abstraction. And he's doing it because, as we said, he was a thinking man. Like Matisse, Cezanne, they were intellectual types. They were interested in psychoanalysis. They were interested in the motivations of human beings. They were interested in how the human brain works. All of these ethereal things that people were discussing at this time. This is why his work began somewhat realistically, that we can see this as a Mont Sainte-Victoire, but it becomes more and more and more abstract until it ends up like cubes. And the artists were so indebted to his will to take such a huge leap that after he painted his wife's face with green here, Cezanne, you see green faces almost everywhere in this period in the art world. They are saying that their admiration for Cezanne has not gone unnoticed. This is all works made by André Derain as self-portraits, and then his portrait of Matisse. And this is why we see this green face in Chagall's work, and why he even made paintings of his own wife, Matisse, with this green stripe. In fact, he makes this green stripe come alive more than once. This is his poor wife that married an attorney and in his place got an artist. Now, what happens is the public was so enraged when these things went on exhibition, these paintings, these kind of cruel representations of what some people would call art in this 1905 exposition, that some French people came up to these works and started attacking them with their nails. This was such an insult to good art. Being that the Stein family were all immersed in business because their father was a great businessman and because Michael actually was an excellent businessman as well, they decided, well, better to be infamous than famous in this case, because everybody and his brother was writing about the horrors of the works of Matisse. Therefore, Matisse is not only invited to their home for lunch, but they buy his work. Sarah and Michael buy one work, and then Leo and Gertrude buy the other. And because both of them are so desperate to make a living and to have some money coming in, of course, they will make the portraits of their patrons as a gift for them. And in addition to that, because these youngish men, Matisse was at this time maybe 35 and Picasso was maybe 20-ish, they're going to be actually rivals from this point forward till the end of their life, but at the same time, they will admire each other. What we can say effectively, and this isn't, unquestionably true, Gertrude and Leo Stein, because they were not married and didn't have children, and later, of course, Gertrude and Alice Toklas will live here, because there wasn't a kind of a family to be living in this space. All kinds of writers and authors and poets and all of the great names from the 20th century, like Ezra Pound or James Joyce or Hemingway, all of them would have come here to not only show their literary works to Gertrude Stein, but this will be the first modern art museum that ever existed. No one wanted to purchase these works. No one saw the value in these works, but Gertrude and Leo were authors. Michael was also very much a fan of all this, but Gertrude and Leo were proper authors. And they were able to write about the people that meet in their house. This, by the way, was maybe 500 square feet of space where the 20th century began. These important people that were coming here, including Dr. Barnes, for goodness sakes. Dr. Barnes is going to end up here and take advice from Gertrude Stein as to which art pieces he should buy. Well, Matisse and Duran, they go to Collioure, kind of a northern part, I believe it's in the northern part of France, where they're making these kind of paintings. But what will make Matisse world famous is this work. This work, quite frankly, is an orgy. An orgy is given a lot of respect, I guess, by being called a bacchanal or a Dionysian party, a Dionysian, I don't know what you would call it, an outdoor party. Many hundreds of years ago, if not thousands of years ago, a bacchanal or a Dionysian celebration permitted people for 3 days out of the year to do whatever the heck they wanted. Consequently, they took advantage of having a wonderful time out of doors in every aspect of the word. This was painted hundreds of times because in actual fact, it was erotica under the name of history painting because it's referring to a bacchanal, which has to do with a Roman holiday. Well, what happens with Matisse, who we saw before, is very much connected to the classical world. He's connected to history paintings. They mean a lot to him. He studied a lot of them. What he does is he makes a picture of a bacchanal in a very new way, which we just talked about. It's very flat. It has color blocks. It's designed with the dynamism of the body to show you what people are doing, what's going on here. And it's a kind of story that we still recognize the people. We recognize this traditional butterfly pose. This is a very big tradition in classical art because it lifts the woman's body and it shows you the curves everywhere more so and makes her youthful and energetic and so on and so forth. Well, Matisse, his work ended up at the Barnes Foundation. And why did it make its way into the Barnes Foundation? Because it was such a large piece and Matisse was living with 3 children and a wife in a tiny apartment. He could only hang it in Gertrude Stein's home because there was room for it. And in addition to that, he will become known for this blue nude. But I'll tell you why after I show you why is it that he's painting a blue nude. Picasso is still not making a lot of money. He's still staying in his apartment at the Bateau Lavoir, where behind him is the River Seine, and where he meets up with the most impoverished people in the world that are almost starving to death. And he's painting them in this kind of blue period style of mourning for those people who are the have-nots, and he is flattening the surfaces as well and using these kind of colors because he probably doesn't have a lot of money to buy a lot of color, but he's using these expressions that are full of anxiety and poverty and, you know, telling story of people that are living on the edge of starvation. Because his blue period began to be written about so much by the Steins, Leo and Gertrude, well, of course, Matisse now has to make a blue nude. But again, he's always tied to the ancients. So this happens to be the de Medici tomb, in which he has been inspired by one of the nudes there by Michelangelo. Well, those people that came to see all this work were being instructed by Gertrude, Leo, and Alice Toklas later as to why these kind of paintings have value. They are essentially educating the public to the fact that there's a tremendous influence in modern art that has to do with all those things that take place in the human mind. And it's astonishing what is happening in the human mind. It is a place in which we have thoughts, continuous thoughts that are completely disconnected 24/7. Even when we're sleeping, our mind is dreaming. Even when we are not aware of it, we're having 10,000 thoughts that come to it all at once, which came to be known as stream of consciousness. And our American physician, mystic, psychologist, teacher, whose name is William James, just happened to have a student in his class called Gertrude Stein when she was studying at Radcliffe. Because these discussions were going on about feelings, about the expression that takes place in the human mind that doesn't have words, the many expressions, the many thoughts that we have, that sometimes music can answer even to help us define some of these complex feelings. What we have then is a representation of this kind of stream of consciousness style in which Matisse is making a picture that is representational of a history painting in a completely new way. But Picasso was his antagonist, and Picasso wanted to sell more art than Matisse could sell. He wanted to be king of the hill. And so he did something that went completely haywire when it comes to representations in which we have recognizable figures. Now, what Matisse is going to have to go up against this enormous challenge, but I don't think he will ever actually meet the challenge because Picasso will outdo him at every turn. Picasso is being influenced by the history of the world, essentially. He is interested in one composition capturing the history of art from the very beginning. He includes in his work African masks, Cycladic figurines that were made 3,000 years ago in Greece. These, you can see the butterfly pose here that is kind of squared up and more cubist than we would expect it. It's been used everywhere forever. The elongated dimensions of Modigliani, the backs of the Turkish baths that Delacroix made, the eye that comes from the Egyptian world. All of those things are here. It's a kind of this cubism, this morphing into a stump. Everything that is taking place here, this is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. There's a street called Avignon in Barcelona, which was known for its brothels. So we are now shown a picture of a brothel and the various ladies that provide services there. So we can see even in this still life, Picasso is saying to us with this melon and how sharp it is, perhaps you should be careful where you eat. There are no words for this piece of art. On top of that, I never even noticed that this woman's hand was up holding back a drape. What is she doing holding up a drape? And then I went to the Ringling Museum and I realized, oh, of course, the Rubens works, the angels are holding back the theatrical story that is being told here on a stage, a biblical story. They're holding up the curtain. It's astonishing. It's absolutely astonishing. And if you have a proponent like Gertrude Stein, who was all mouth and all big body and extremely capable of convincing the world that what she thought was the only way to think. That was her reason for being. She was so profoundly strong, not only in her opinions, but in the way that she argued them. And it was obvious that she was very intelligent and astute and was a cosmopolitan person of the first order. Well, why else would Abby Aldridge Rockefeller have bought this piece? Abby Aldridge Rockefeller worked for 10 solid years, putting pressure on her curator to get this piece for the MoMA. The MoMA would not be the MoMA without this piece. This is the falling off point to modernism. Since Gertrude Stein was kind of by degrees making Picasso and Matisse and Braque such important contributors to the modern world. And as we said also with Seurat, all of those experiments that were taking place and innovative operations that were taking place around the capability of the human eye and how it worked, what Braque and Picasso are doing here is they're making little cubist pictures inside a big picture as they are studying, and their eyes are moving across these kind of bistro tables that are their living room. All the artists and writers at this time lived in these cafes because their home was a little apartment with no bathroom facilities, even, never mind cooking something. So this is what they're looking at. This is why we see a newspaper or a bottle of Pernod or an ashtray or cigarettes or whatever it is that they're doing here. And even this kind of, this ability of Braque to add these kind of elements of shiny surfaces, it's because these tables were so shiny. But Gertrude Stein, let's not forget, she has literary aspirations. And if she has literary aspirations, then maybe she can use words like they use pictures. And she can make a Cubist literacy or literary poem, I should say, a Cubist literary poem in which she is sitting next to a woman called Rose, and they're looking at the tiny little alligators in a pond at the Luxembourg Gardens. Rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose. Just like those constant thoughts that we have, gotta pick up the dry cleaning, gotta pick up the dry cleaning. Oops, better watch that car. Not only was she proficient at changing the minds of the Parisians and then the Western world in Europe, she and Alfred Stieglitz became a huge team. He was the one that was proposing that Picasso start to send his work to America. He was trying to sell photographs, but Americans didn't think photographs were art. Anyway, big long story. what happens with Alfred Stieglitz is he gets involved with the first major modern art show in America, in which they changed the Armory building into this magnificent art center with individual galleries. And the whole world was looking at America, a country that is being built in 1913 by immigrants and the most impoverished people of the world. These men all get together and decide that they're going to put on a modern art show in America. But because no one in America has even seen the French Impressionist artworks anywhere yet, they have to educate the public as to what they're going to see. Beginning in 1911, for 2 years, they started to publish these kind of journals so that they would ready the public who was going to pay $5 a ticket, which was the equivalent of maybe $120, $30 for a person at that time who would have earned $5 for a whole week in a sweatshop. But they continuously put out for 2 years what was going to come to the show, and no one could believe it. No one could believe that this could be considered fine art. And they printed lots and lots of postcards because they knew people would want to buy these postcards to show their friends so everybody could have a good laugh over, guess what's coming to America? And you can see here, they're absolutely being slaughtered by the press. Cartoons everywhere. That the old masters are jumping off the walls of the Metropolitan Museum when they see this kind of nonsense with Cubism, and everybody is writing this in the newspapers. Cubist exhibition, which started a riot, etc., etc. And the old masters are dumbstruck. This is the kind of work that people were seeing, and they didn't see the transition between the French Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and the Cubists and the Fauvists, etc. And so what Matisse was being interviewed at a certain point, and he said, well, I have been bothered all my life to paint. I went into law and I couldn't stay there because my obsession was painting. And he said, I was desperately trying to use paint to convey feelings. What did people want? Nobody could understand. What is happening here? Oh, and the Cubist works were put in the gallery that was referred to as the Chamber of Horrors. Where else would you see a cartoon with such beautifully dressed people that she would dare go to a museum and put her elbow on a pedestal where a piece of sculpture is sitting? But obviously, they're showing you that people are horrified to have seen these works that were Picasso sculpture pieces. Well, Matisse's work here, by the way, some people were astute enough to know that art moves on, but Matisse also had this piece for sale, 1913, for $4,050, which at that time was equivalent to $40,000, and which in today's money would be almost $1 million. However, this piece would sell in the multi-millions. So this is Matisse's art studio. Now, everyone and his brother knows that an art studio should probably look more like this center area. Or perhaps an artist studio might look like this, but it certainly doesn't look like this. So what can this give the public? Well, as it happens, it serves as inspiration for other things. Because if there's one thing that Matisse did, is he certainly changed the way that our interiors looked. Here we have a painting by Matisse in which the black and white area lets us rest for a moment. But certainly there are some people that have homes decorated in this way. We think nothing of combining all kinds of patterns and prints and checks and polka dots. And this is the way we live today. If you're lucky enough, your house maybe looks a little bit like a harem. However, when we look at the work of Matisse, he has certainly inspired the way that we live our lives. Many people love doing all kind of patterns like this. It makes you feel 1,000% alive. He influenced the decorative arts in many ways, and interior design, and certainly fashion. Fashion is very often inspired by Matisse. Picasso, however, cannot be touched in terms of his ability to do creative things. He stands alone. I don't know if there's anyone in this period doing this style of work that has ever touched Picasso. But you see, Matisse is a civilized human being, and we can see that in his work. And he loves women. He's a gentleman. And Picasso, well, he's a monster. Picasso is a lovable monster. In terms of the influence of Picasso and Cubism and how far it went, in many, many ways, Cubism has been the language that inspired the first half of the 20th century. Everyone was interested in how shapes relate to other shapes, how colors relate to other colors, and it was appropriated by architects and minimalists who wanted to reduce the nonsense of Victorian decor. They also wanted to simplify interiors so that more people could afford to have furniture, because how many people can afford to have velvet chairs and carved wood, furnishings, etc. And of course, one of the most profound effects was on architects who were liberated, in this case, Frank Gehry, liberated from any way that any building should look. And luckily, I went to see this place, Bilbao. I couldn't believe that they even had sandstone that was different shades of beige and brown so that it would look like a Cubist painting. But this is a tour de force work, something that has never seen before. It's three-dimensional Cubism that liberated artists from anything that they'd ever seen before. And we have really Gertrude Stein to thank for that. She's the one that promoted that new ideas are not popular, but it doesn't mean they don't have value. And even though there were other artists that were equally good, if not better than Matisse, like Raoul Dufy, whose work is much more appealing to me than anything that Matisse did at Collioure, or Maurice de Vlaminck, a lot of very interesting work with unique concepts. His work is dynamic, interesting in many ways. Or this man, his name is Félix Vallotton. I love his work. I love the mystery. I love everything that's going on here. His work is outstanding. But it's the Stein family that put Matisse forward, and they did not put Vallotton forward. And even though Vallotton did this portrait of Gertrude Stein, which is a far more realistic picture of her, and in fact, Gertrude Stein complained to Picasso and said, "I look nothing like that." And he said, "Oh, but you will." She is the one that is at the Metropolitan Museum. And it's not Vallotton's, but Picasso's work. Modern art had a profound effect on the 20th century. It freed the mind from reality to the world of imagination. It permeated literature, photography, dance, sculpture, and architecture. It is an open way of thinking. a break with the old world into a new sphere with endless possibilities. It represented an opportunity to dream of things that don't exist, but that can be made real, tangible, like radio, television, internet, travel to the moon, all the things that live in the ether. So I ask you, how many roles do you think these two artists played? I see that there's someone that was asking a question in the chat room. I don't know. Did someone write it? I don't see a chat, but it looks like someone was asking something.